Hello, dear listeners, and welcome back to another cozy night of mystery and murder. Tonight, we travel back to a winter-long past, to a small, snowbound inn where the wind howls like something alive, and the roads have vanished beneath a merciless white blanket. A handful of strangers, forced together by the storm, will soon discover that the cold outside is nothing compared to what waits within these walls. By morning, one of them will be dead, and not a single soul could have slipped away unseen. But amongst the frightened guests sits a quiet old woman with knitting needles in her hands and a mind sharper than any blizzard wind, our own Mrs. Florence of Brambledene village. So pour yourself something warm, settle in, and let's step into the storm together. This is Mrs. Florence and the Blizzard Night Killer. The storm arrives. The snow had begun as a light, almost polite dusting over the hills of Brambledene, the kind that made old Mrs. Florence pause at her cottage window with a small smile and think of Christmas cards. By the time her hired car reached the narrow road winding toward Hartsmore Pass, however, that politeness had vanished entirely. The wind screamed across the moor like something with a grievance, and the flakes no longer drifted. They attacked, sideways and furious, until the driver could barely see past the bonnet. "I don't like this one bit, madam," he muttered, gripping the wheel as the car shuddered against a fresh gust. "Begging your pardon, but we may not make it back to the village tonight." Mrs. Florence, a small, round-shouldered woman of some 70 years, sat wrapped in a grey wool coat with a tartan travelling rug across her knees, her ever-present knitting bag resting beside her like a faithful dog. She had been visiting her niece in the next county and was now paying, rather dearly, for having stayed one day too long. "Then we shall simply have to find shelter, Mr. Higgins," she said placidly, as though they were discussing nothing more alarming than a delayed train. There is no sense fretting over what the weather has already decided. It was Higgins who spotted the light first, a warm, wavering glow through the white chaos, low and welcoming, like a candle left in a window for a lost traveller. A weathered sign, half buried in drift, swung and creaked on its hinges, the Sleeping Fox Inn. "Thank heaven," Higgins breathed, and turned the car up the short, snow-choked lane. The inn was an old stone building, squat and sturdy, the sort that had clearly weathered 100 such storms before, and intended to weather 100 more. Smoke rose from its chimney, in defiant curls, snatched away almost instantly by the wind. As Higgins helped Mrs. Florence from the car, she noted, for she noted everything, though rarely aloud, that there were already 2 other vehicles nearly swallowed by drift near the stable wall, their windows frosted opaque. Not the only travellers seeking refuge tonight, she thought, and tucked her knitting bag more firmly under her arm before making her way, carefully, toward the door. Inside, the contrast was immediate and rather delicious. The golden crackle of a great fire, the smell of wood smoke and something savoury simmering in a pot, the low murmur of voices that stilled, just slightly, as the door banged open and cold air rushed in with her. A stout woman with flour-dusted hands and an apron the colour of dried cherries hurried forward. "Oh, my dear soul, come in, you'll catch your death standing there." She ushered Mrs. Florence toward the fire with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had spent decades managing far larger crises than one elderly guest. "I'm Mrs. Dobbin. My husband and I keep the Fox. You'll not be going anywhere else tonight, I'm afraid. The pass'll be shut by now, mark my words." "How very fortunate, then, that you were here to catch me," Mrs. Florence said warmly, settling into a wingback chair near the hearth with a small, contented sigh, as though she had planned this detour all along. It was only once the initial fuss of wet coats and hot tea had settled that she had the leisure to look properly about the room, and Mrs. Florence, though she would never have admitted it, dearly loved to look. There were, she counted, 5 others already gathered in the low-beamed sitting room, each arranged with the particular stiffness of strangers thrown together by circumstance rather than choice. Nearest the fire sat a tall, narrow-faced man in an expensive but travel-crumpled overcoat, a leather document case, resting protectively against his leg, as though it contained something far more precious than paper. He had the restless air of a man accustomed to being elsewhere, checking his pocket watch with a frequency that suggested time itself had personally offended him. Across from him, a young woman in a fashionable blue coat sat very upright, hands folded, her gaze fixed determinedly on the flames rather than on the elderly man beside her, her father perhaps, or an uncle, who kept glancing at her with an expression Mrs. Florence could only describe as watchful. Not affectionate watchfulness, something with a harder edge to it. By the window, half in shadow, a broad-shouldered man in a heavy traveling coat stood rather than sat, arms crossed, studying the storm outside, with the fixed concentration of someone who did not care for being trapped anywhere. And nearest the small bar, perched on a stool with a glass of something amber already in hand, sat a cheerful-looking gentleman of middle years, his colour high, his laugh a touch too loud for the room, who introduced himself before anyone had asked. "Bertie Finch," he announced, raising his glass toward Mrs. Florence. "Commercial traveller, terrible driver, and now, it seems, your fellow prisoner of the storm. We're quite the merry band, aren't we?" No one, Mrs. Florence noted, laughed. Mrs. Dobbin, bustling between them with a tray of hot toddies, performed introductions with the weary patience of a woman who had already done this once that evening. The document case man was a Mr. Aldous Price, up from London on business. The watchful older gentleman was a Colonel Whitcomb, travelling with his niece, Miss Evelyn Carr, to visit family for the new year. The broad-shouldered man by the window gave his name only as Marsh, and little else, which struck Mrs. Florence as its own small piece of information. "And you, ma'am?" Mrs. Dobbin asked kindly. "Florence Ashworth," she said, settling her knitting needles into her lap with the ease of long habit. "Though everyone in Brambledene simply calls me Mrs. Florence, I do hope I'm not imposing terribly, arriving so unexpectedly." "Not at all, not at all," said Mrs. Dobbin. "The more the merrier on a night like this. Though heaven knows what we'll do for beds, we've only the 4 rooms free." It was, Mrs. Florence would reflect much later, the first small crack in the evening's civility, a flicker of something tight and calculating that passed, just briefly, across more than one face at the mention of limited rooms, limited space, limited privacy. 6 strangers and their hosts, sealed together by a storm that showed no sign of relenting, in a house with more secrets, she suspected, than spare beds. Outside, the wind gave a long, low howl against the shutters, like something testing the strength of the walls. Mrs. Florence picked up her knitting, counted a stitch, and smiled pleasantly at no one in particular. How very interesting, she thought. This is going to be. Strangers under one roof. Dinner at the Sleeping Fox was served in the low-ceilinged dining room at 7:30. A hearty stew of mutton and root vegetables, thick bread still warm from the oven, and a bottle of red wine that Mr. Dobbin produced from some cellar with evident pride. It was, under any other circumstance, precisely the sort of meal Mrs. Florence would have enjoyed enormously. As it was, she found the food excellent, and the company considerably more interesting than the food. 6 strangers around one table, she thought, settling her napkin into her lap, was rather like 6 pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, tipped from different boxes, each with its own picture, its own edges, and no obvious way of knowing yet how, or whether, they fit together. "You must forgive us if we seem a dull lot," said Colonel Whitcomb, seating himself at the head of the table with the easy authority of a man used to being obeyed, even by strangers. He was perhaps 60, silver-haired, with the ramrod posture of old military service, and eyes that missed very little, though, Mrs. Florence noted, they missed rather more when it came to his niece. "We were meant to be halfway to Evelyn's cousins by now. Instead, here we sit." "There are far worse places to be stranded, Colonel," Mrs. Florence said pleasantly. "A warm fire and good company are not to be taken lightly on a night like this." Miss Evelyn Carr, seated beside her uncle, offered only a small, tight smile and said nothing. She was perhaps 24, pretty in a pale, delicate way, and Mrs. Florence noticed, for she noticed such things, that the young woman's hands, though folded neatly in her lap, were not quite still. Her fingers pressed, released, pressed again against the fabric of her skirt, the small unconscious rhythm of someone holding something in rather than letting it out. "And you, Mr. Price," Bertie Finch said cheerfully, waving his wineglass toward the narrow-faced man across the table. "What business could possibly be so urgent as to send a man out into a blizzard?" Aldous Price did not look up immediately from his stew. "Contracts," he said shortly. "Time-sensitive ones." "Contracts don't care much for weather, do they?" Finch laughed, though the laugh found no company at the table. "No," Price agreed. "They don't." His document case, Mrs. Florence observed, had travelled with him even to dinner, resting now against the leg of his chair rather than left upstairs with his coat, as any reasonable man might have left it. A small thing, but small things, in Mrs. Florence's long experience, were so very often the only things that mattered. The man called Marsh spoke least of all. He ate quickly, efficiently, answering direct questions with the fewest words possible and volunteering nothing. When Mrs. Dobbin asked, in passing, where he'd been travelling from, he said only, "North," and returned to his stew as though the matter were closed. Mrs. Florence found herself wondering, not for the first time that evening, what a man travelled toward, or away from, on a night when sensible people stayed home. It was Bertie Finch, predictably, who kept the conversation from collapsing entirely into silence, filling every pause with some anecdote or observation, his voice a touch too bright, his laughter a touch too frequent for a man merely delayed on his travels. "You know," he said, refilling his glass for the third time, "there's something almost delicious about a night like this. Cut off from the whole world. No telephone." He gestured toward the old wall set in the corner, silent and useless. The lines no doubt brought down somewhere out in the storm. No way in, no way out. "Just us, and whatever secrets we've all brought along with our luggage." He laughed at his own remark, raising his glass as though toasting the idea. No one laughed with him. Colonel Whitcomb's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Miss Carr's fingers pressed once more against her skirt. Mr. Price's spoon paused, very briefly, over his bowl. How curious, Mrs. Florence thought, sipping her tea rather than the wine, for she had never much cared for the stuff, that such an idle jest should land so heavily on so many shoulders at once. "Well, I for one have no secrets worth the trouble of hiding," she said lightly, breaking the small, uncomfortable silence with the practiced ease of a woman who had spent 40 years smoothing over village tea parties gone awkward. "Only a niece who worries far too much when I'm late, and a cat who will be most put out that I've missed his supper." The small joke did its work. Mrs. Dobbin laughed, the tension eased a degree, and talk turned, mercifully, to safer things, the depth of the drifts outside, whether the pass might clear by morning, the wisdom of Mr. Dobbin's cellar. Mrs. Florence contributed just enough to seem entirely unremarkable, a harmless old woman with opinions on knitting patterns and mild curiosity about her fellow guests, while privately cataloguing every detail with the quiet thoroughness she had once brought to Brambledene's Women's Institute accounts, back when she'd caught the treasurer skimming 3p a week for 11 months running. She noted that Marsh's boots, drying by the kitchen door, were caked with mud beneath the fresh snow, mud that suggested he had been walking, not driving, for some considerable distance before ever reaching a car. She noted that Mr. Price ate with his left hand, but held his wineglass, always, with his right, the mark perhaps of an old injury, or perhaps of something else entirely. She noted that Colonel Whitcomb, for all his talk of family visits and New Year cheer, had not once mentioned his niece's mother, nor asked after any other relation by name, as though the visit itself were a story constructed rather than lived. And she noted, most of all, the small, careful distance Evelyn Carr kept between herself and her uncle throughout the meal. Not the easy closeness of family, but the wary, practiced distance of someone who had learned, through long habit, precisely how far she was permitted to lean before being pulled back. By the time Mrs. Dobbin cleared the last of the plates and the men retired to the sitting room for brandy and cigars, Mrs. Florence had gathered rather more from an evening's polite dinner conversation than most detectives managed from a week of formal interrogation. "You've barely touched your knitting all evening," Mrs. Dobbin observed kindly, settling into the chair opposite as the fire was fed fresh logs against the deepening cold. "I thought you never went anywhere without it." "Oh, I never do," Mrs. Florence said, smiling and taking up her needles at last. The soft click-click, a small, comforting counterpoint to the storm still howling beyond the shutters. "But there is a great deal to be said, Mrs. Dobbin, for simply watching before one begins to work." Outside, the wind had risen again, flinging fresh snow against the windows with a sound like scattered gravel. Somewhere upstairs, a door closed. Not loudly, but with the particular firmness of someone who very much wished to be alone. Mrs. Florence counted her stitches and waited. Cracks in the ice. By 10 o'clock, the sitting room had settled into the particular quiet of a house waiting out a storm. The fire crackling low, the wind still flinging itself against the shutters with undiminished fury, and the 6 guests arranged about the room in postures of studied relaxation that fooled, Mrs. Florence rather thought, absolutely no one. Bertie Finch had claimed the armchair nearest the brandy decanter and showed no inclination of relinquishing either. Colonel Whitcomb sat with a newspaper he was not reading, his eyes drifting every few moments toward his niece, who had positioned herself as far from him as the small room allowed, ostensibly absorbed in a battered novel from the inn's modest shelf. Marsh remained by the window, as he had all evening, though the storm outside had long since swallowed anything worth watching, and Mr. Price sat at the small writing desk in the corner, his document case now open before him, sorting through papers with the tight, joyless efficiency of a man who found no pleasure in his own work. Mrs. Florence knitted. She had reached the heel of a grey woolen sock, a birthday gift for her nephew, though the birthday in question was some months distant, which suited her purposes admirably, since a project with no urgent deadline was the perfect cover for an evening of quiet, unhurried observation. It was Bertie Finch who broke the peace, as she rather suspected he would. He had had, by her count, 4 brandies to the meal's wine, and the combination had loosened whatever discretion he might once have possessed. "I say, Price," he called across the room, his words only faintly slurred, but his volume entirely unchecked. "What is it you're so anxious about over there? You've been at those papers since we left the table. Contracts, was it?" He gave a lazy, needling grin. "Or something a bit more interesting?" Price did not look up. "It's nothing that concerns you, Mr. Finch." "Oh, come now. We're all friends here, aren't we? Trapped together till the storm lets up. Might as well be honest with one another." Finch heaved himself up from his chair, with the loose-limbed confidence of a man who believed himself considerably more charming than he was, and ambled toward the writing desk. "What's in the case, then? State secrets?" "Finch." The word came out sharper than anything Price had said all evening, and his hand moved, quick, instinctive, to close the leather case, before Finch could see its contents. "I said it's nothing that concerns you. Steady on, old man, no need to snap. I said leave it." The room went very still. Even the fire seemed, for a moment, to crackle more quietly. Colonel Whitcomb lowered his unread newspaper. Evelyn Carr's eyes lifted from her book, wide and wary. Marsh, at the window, turned his head just slightly, the first sign of real interest he had shown all evening. Finch raised both hands in mock surrender, though his grin had thinned into something less good-natured. No offense meant, I'm sure. He returned to his chair, but not before Mrs. Florence caught the look he threw over his shoulder at the closed document case. Not the sheepish glance of a man merely rebuffed, but something closer to calculation. He knew something, or suspected something, about the contents of that case, and the knowledge sat with him rather uncomfortably. How very interesting, Mrs. Florence thought again, her needles never once pausing in their steady rhythm, that a simple question about a briefcase should provoke quite so much heat. Mrs. Dobbin appeared in the doorway a moment later, drawn perhaps by the change in the room's temperature, even from the kitchen. More tea for anyone? Or something a bit stronger, given the weather. Her cheerful tone did the useful work of easing the tension, and within a few minutes, the room had settled back into something resembling its earlier calm, though Mrs. Florence noted that Price now kept one hand resting, quite deliberately, atop his closed case, as though it might otherwise wander off on its own. It was some 20 minutes later, as Mrs. Florence made her way toward the small downstairs washroom off the back hall, that she came upon the second small fracture of the evening. Evelyn Carr stood near the base of the stairs, half in shadow, her voice pitched low but urgent, speaking to someone Mrs. Florence could not immediately see around the turn of the corridor. "You promised me, after Christmas, that it would be finished. You promised. These things take time, Evelyn." Colonel Whitcomb's voice, equally low, carried an edge Mrs. Florence had not heard at dinner, something harder, beneath the polished, avuncular warmth. "You don't understand the position I'm in." "I understand that you've said the same thing for 2 years." A small, sharp catch in the young woman's voice, quickly suppressed. "I am not a child any longer, Uncle. I won't simply—" "Keep your voice down." Whitcomb's tone dropped further, urgent now, rather than merely firm. "This is not the place, and certainly not the night." Mrs. Florence, who had paused with one hand resting lightly on the wall as though merely catching her breath after the stairs, judged this the moment to make her presence gently known rather than risk the appearance of eavesdropping, though she had, of course, heard every word she needed to hear. "Oh, do forgive me," she said, stepping around the corner with the mild, faintly apologetic air of an elderly woman, rather slow on her feet. "I'm afraid I've quite lost my bearings in this old house. Is the washroom this way, or have I gone entirely the wrong direction?" The effect was immediate. Evelyn Carr stepped back from her uncle, as though scalded, her face arranging itself, with visible effort, into something approaching composure. Colonel Whitcomb's own expression smoothed over so quickly and so completely that Mrs. Florence found herself almost admiring the performance. "Just along there, Mrs. Ashworth," he said, gesturing with perfect courtesy toward the end of the hall, as though he had been doing nothing more than exchanging pleasantries with his niece. "Second door." "How kind. Thank you so much." Mrs. Florence smiled at them both and continued on her way, moving with the unhurried shuffle of old age, though her mind had already filed away every word of what she'd overheard, turning it over with the same careful attention she gave a dropped stitch. A promise, twice broken. Money, most probably, given the particular flavor of that word, position. And a young woman who has stopped believing her uncle's assurances, but has not yet worked out what she means to do about it. By the time she returned to the sitting room, the household had begun, one by one, to retire. Mrs. Dobbin's offer of hot water bottles accepted gratefully all round, candles and lamps distributed for the walk upstairs, since the storm had, sometime in the last hour, taken the electric light with it entirely. "You'll have the small room at the end of the corridor, Mrs. Ashworth," Mrs. Dobbin said, leading the way up the narrow staircase, lamp held aloft. "I'm afraid it's not much, but it's warm, and that's what counts on a night like this." "It sounds perfectly delightful," Mrs. Florence assured her, and meant it. At the top of the stairs, the guests dispersed to their respective doors with murmured good nights. Civil, careful, each one, Mrs. Florence noted, closing their door with just a fraction more force than good manners strictly required, as though eager to seal themselves away from whatever tensions the evening had stirred. Only as she settled at last into her own narrow bed, the wind still shrieking its long complaint against the shutters, did Mrs. Florence allow herself to consider, quite calmly, the small collection of facts the evening had yielded. A briefcase, guarded like something far more valuable than contracts. A promise, broken more than once, involving money or its absence. A watchfulness in Colonel Whitcomb that had nothing to do with fondness. And beneath it all, 6 strangers sealed together by a storm that showed no sign of relenting. Each one, she rather suspected, carrying something they had hoped never to unpack in front of company. She blew out her candle, folded her hands atop the counterpane, and closed her eyes. Tomorrow, she thought, with the particular calm of a woman who had seen a great many storms come and go, we shall see what the night has left behind. Outside, the wind gave a final, furious howl, and then, quite suddenly, somewhere below, a door slammed. The body in the snow. Morning came grey and strange, the storm finally spent, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt almost louder than the wind had been. Mrs. Florence woke early, as she always did, and lay for a moment listening to the unfamiliar quiet before rising to draw back the thin curtain. The world outside had been entirely remade. Snow lay in great smooth drifts against the stable wall, burying the two cars to their windows, erasing the lane, the hedgerows, every familiar line of the landscape beneath a single unbroken white. It was, she thought, rather beautiful and rather final. No one would be leaving the Sleeping Fox that morning, very possibly not that day at all. She dressed with her usual unhurried care, tucked her knitting into its bag, more from habit than intention, and made her way downstairs, where the smell of frying bacon suggested Mrs. Dobbin had risen earlier still. But it was not Mrs. Dobbin's cheerful bustle that greeted her at the bottom of the stairs. It was a scream. The sound came from beyond the kitchen, sharp and short, cut off almost as soon as it began. And then Mrs. Dobbin's voice, high and unsteady, calling for her husband, in a tone Mrs. Florence had heard only rarely in her long life, and never without consequence. She followed the sound, moving with rather more speed than her 70 years generally permitted, through the kitchen and out the back door, where the cold struck her like a slap, and the scene before her struck harder still. Bertie Finch lay in the snow beside the woodshed, some 20 feet from the house, on his back, one arm flung out, as though reaching for something just beyond his grasp. The snow around him was disturbed in a wide, ragged circle, but what caught Mrs. Florence's eye immediately, and would not release it, was the dark stain spreading beneath him, already crusted at its edges with frost, and the handle of a kitchen knife protruding from his chest at an angle that left no room whatsoever for accident. Mrs. Dobbin stood a few feet away, both hands pressed to her mouth, her husband's arm around her shoulders, his own face white as the drift behind him. "Don't touch anything," Mrs. Florence said, quietly, but with a firmness that surprised even her, and something in her tone was enough to still the small, panicked movement Mr. Dobbin had been making toward the body. "Not yet. We must be careful." By the time the others had gathered, drawn by the commotion, wrapping themselves hastily in coats against the cold, faces ranging from horror to a carefully composed blankness that Mrs. Florence noted with particular interest, the full shape of the situation had begun to settle over the group like a second, colder storm. "Good God," Colonel Whitcomb said, staring down at the body with an expression Mrs. Florence found difficult to read. Shock, certainly, but something else beneath it, something almost like calculation. "What in heaven's name happened here?" "He's dead," Marsh said flatly, which struck Mrs. Florence as both obvious and, somehow, entirely characteristic of the man, a fact stated without ornament, without the softening that grief or shock generally demanded. "But how?" Evelyn Carr's voice was thin, trembling. "How could anyone have? The storm! Surely no one could have come from outside." "No one came from outside," Mrs. Florence said, and though her voice remained gentle, it carried across the small, huddled group with a weight that made every head turn toward her. "Look at the snow, my dears. There is only one set of tracks anywhere near him, and they are his own, leading from the house to this spot and no further. No footprints approaching from beyond the property, no footprints leaving it." It was true, and as the others took in the scene properly for the first time, the truth of it settled over them with visible, physical effect. The snow around the body was disturbed only where Finch himself had walked, and where, presumably, he had fallen, his own tracks, and nothing else, in a stretch of unbroken white that ran unmarked all the way to the buried stone wall at the property's edge. "That's not possible," Aldous Price said, though his voice lacked the conviction of a man who truly believed his own protest. There must be some explanation. There is an explanation, Mrs. Florence said. The most uncomfortable one. Whoever did this did not come from outside at all. She let the words settle, watching, as she always did, not merely what was said in response, but what crossed each face in the silence before anyone spoke. They came from inside this house, and unless I am very much mistaken, they are standing among us at this very moment. The reaction rippled through the small group with almost visible force. Evelyn Carr's hand flew to her throat. Colonel Whitcomb's jaw set hard, his eyes sweeping the assembled faces with new and sudden suspicion. Marcia's expression did not change at all, which was, in its way, the most telling reaction of the lot. And Aldous Price took one small, involuntary step backward, as though putting distance between himself and an accusation not yet spoken. Mr. Dobbin, still white-faced, found his voice at last. The telephone lines are down, have been since last night. And the lane won't be passable for days, not with drifts like these. There's no getting word to the police, not till this clears. Then, Mrs. Florence said, with the calm, terrible practicality of a woman accustomed to unpleasant facts, we are quite alone with this for the present. Which means, I'm afraid, that we must be very careful indeed, with the evidence, and with one another. She knelt, with rather more difficulty than she would have liked to admit, beside the body, close enough to observe, careful not to disturb, and took in, with the swift, thorough attention of long practice, the details that mattered. The knife was a plain kitchen implement, the sort that might have come from any drawer in the house. Not a weapon brought specially then, but one taken up in the moment, or perhaps planned with the deliberate use of something untraceable to any single owner. Finch's coat was only half-buttoned, suggesting he had dressed hastily or been persuaded outside without full preparation for the cold. His expression, what remained visible of it, held not the blank slackness of a man taken entirely by surprise, but something tighter. Surprise, yes, but also, she thought, the last flicker of recognition. He had known, in his final moment, precisely who stood before him. And there, half buried already by the night's final flurries but not quite erased, was a second faint impression in the snow beside the body. Not a footprint, but something smaller, a shallow dent, as though something had been set down, briefly, and then lifted away again. Mrs. Florence said nothing of this discovery aloud. Not yet. We ought to move him inside, Colonel Whitcomb said, some of his military bearing reasserting itself now that the initial shock had passed. Can't leave the poor devil out here. No, Mrs. Florence agreed, rising with Mr. Dobbin's assistance, but we must be exceedingly careful how it's done, and we must disturb nothing else in this snow until we've had a proper chance to look. I know it seems a hard thing to ask, under the circumstances, but whoever did this believed the storm would erase every trace of what happened here. She looked, slowly and deliberately, around the small circle of frightened, shivering faces. I should very much like to prove them wrong. The wind, which had been merely a memory all morning, gave one last small gust across the yard, stirring the loose snow at the body's edge, and for just a moment, Mrs. Florence's sharp eyes caught something else half hidden beneath the drift, near Finch's outstretched hand, a small, torn scrap of paper, its edge just visible above the white. She said nothing of this either. Not yet. There would be time enough, she thought, gathering her coat more closely about her against the bitter cold, for questions. For now, there was only the grim, necessary work of ensuring that whatever secrets this snow still held would not be lost before she'd had the chance to find them. Mrs. Dobbin, she said gently, turning at last from the body, I think perhaps a very strong pot of tea is in order, and then I'm afraid we must all sit down together and talk. Questions by the fire. The sitting room, so cheerful the evening before, had taken on an entirely different character by mid-morning. The fire still burned, and Mrs. Dobbin's tea was, as promised, exceedingly strong, but the warmth of the room did little to thaw the wariness that had settled over its occupants. 6 people. 5 now. Mrs. Florence corrected herself grimly. 6, including herself, sat in a loose circle, each keeping rather more distance from the others than the modest space strictly required. "I don't see," Colonel Whitcomb said, breaking a silence that had stretched on rather too long, "why we should simply sit here waiting. Someone in this room is responsible for what happened to that man, and I should think the sensible course is to establish, quite plainly, where each of us was last night." "An excellent suggestion, Colonel," Mrs. Florence said, settling into her chair with her knitting bag, though she made no move to take up her needles. "This morning called for undivided attention, though I wonder if I might make one small observation first, for all our benefit. Whoever did this took considerable care. A knife from the kitchen, easily accessible to anyone in the house. No obvious signs of struggle beyond what the body itself shows us. And most tellingly, they waited for the perfect moment, a night when the snow itself would erase any trace of their coming or going, and when no possible outside explanation could be offered." She paused, letting her gaze move gently around the circle. "This was not a crime of sudden passion, I think. It was planned, which means whoever is responsible has had rather longer than any of us to prepare their account of themselves. The observation landed exactly as she'd intended, not as an accusation, but as a quiet warning that careful lies would need to withstand careful scrutiny. "Well, I'll go first, if it puts anyone's mind at ease," Marsh said, breaking his customary silence with unexpected bluntness. "I went up to my room straight after the brandy was finished, round about 11. Didn't leave it till I heard the screaming this morning. No one to confirm that, I'm afraid, since I was alone. Take it or leave it." "And before you arrived at the inn yesterday," Mrs. Florence asked mildly, "you mentioned you'd come from the north. Rather a long way to travel in such weather, on foot part of the way, if I'm not mistaken." Something flickered across Marsh's face. Surprise, quickly masked. "My car broke down a few miles back. Had to walk the rest. I don't see what that has to do with anything." "Perhaps nothing at all," Mrs. Florence said pleasantly. "I merely find myself curious about people, Mr. Marsh. An old woman's failing, I'm afraid." Colonel Whitcomb cleared his throat, eager, it seemed, to redirect attention elsewhere. Evelyn and I retired together, more or less. Separate rooms, of course, but at the same time, around 10:30. I heard nothing further until this morning. "I can vouch for my uncle," Evelyn said quickly. Too quickly, Mrs. Florence thought. The words arriving before the question had even fully settled. "We said good night at the top of the stairs. I saw him go into his room." "And did you remain in yours, my dear, for the whole of the night?" Mrs. Florence asked, gently. A small hesitation. "Yes, of course. Of course," Mrs. Florence thought. "And yet you hesitated before saying so." She let the moment pass without comment, filing it away instead, among the growing collection of small inconsistencies that had begun, ever so slightly, to take on a shape. "I was at the writing desk until nearly midnight," Aldous Price offered, when the silence turned expectantly toward him. His hand, Mrs. Florence noted, rested once more atop his document case, which he had brought down with him that morning, as though it were now a permanent extension of his own body. "Finishing some correspondence. Then I went straight to bed. Alone, I take it," Mrs. Florence said, naturally. "And the correspondence, was it connected to the contracts you mentioned, or something rather more personal?" Price's jaw tightened. "I don't see that it's any of your concern, Mrs. Ashworth." "No," she agreed placidly. "Very likely it isn't, though I confess I find myself wondering why a man so anxious to guard his papers from a harmless inquiry over dinner should be quite so unwilling to share even the smallest detail of them this morning, given the circumstances we now find ourselves in." The room had gone very quiet. Price said nothing further, and Mrs. Florence, satisfied she had planted the seed she intended, allowed the silence to stand, rather than pressing further. There would be time yet to pull that particular thread. It was Mr. Dobbin, hovering near the doorway, with the uneasy air of a man who felt some responsibility for events occurring under his own roof, who spoke next. For what it's worth, Mrs. Ashworth, I locked up myself, last thing, round about 11:30. Front door, back door, both bolted from the inside. I checked them again this morning, first thing, before we found him. Both still bolted. Whatever happened last night, no one came in from outside to do it, and no one went out that way either. Not through a locked door, they didn't. Thank you, Mr. Dobbin. That is extremely useful. Mrs. Florence turned her attention, at last, to the point she had been circling since she'd knelt in the snow that morning. Which brings us to the question of the back door, the one nearest the woodshed, through which Mr. Finch evidently went to meet his end. Was that door also locked when you checked it last night? Mr. Dobbin's brow furrowed as he thought back. It was. I'm certain of it. And this morning? A pause. Unlocked, he admitted slowly. I hadn't thought much of it, in all the commotion. Assumed my wife had opened it, going out to the woodshed for kindling, same as she does most mornings. All eyes turned toward Mrs. Dobbin, who paled and shook her head rapidly. I never touched it. I found him because it was already standing open when I went to fetch the wood. That's how I came to see him lying there at all. So, Mrs. Florence said slowly, drawing the threads together aloud for the benefit of the room. The door was locked at 11:30 and unlocked some time before dawn, which tells us, I think, two rather important things. First, that Mr. Finch did not simply wander out on some sleepless whim of his own. Someone unlocked that door, very likely to lure him outside or to follow him out once he'd gone. And second, that whoever did the unlocking had, at some point in the evening, the opportunity to take the key without anyone else noticing. She looked around the circle once more. Where is that key kept, Mr. Dobbin? On a hook by the kitchen door. In plain view, I'm afraid. Anyone passing through could have taken it. Which, Mrs. Florence said quietly, narrows our list of suspects not at all, and yet tells us a great deal about the sort of person we are looking for. Someone who moved through this house last night with confidence, who knew where to find a key, where to find a knife, and precisely when the household would be too occupied with sleep to notice their absence. She folded her hands in her lap, her gaze moving once, slowly, around the room. Someone, I rather think, who has been planning this rather longer than one snowbound evening. No one spoke. Outside, the wind had died to nothing at all, leaving only the vast, indifferent silence of the snow. And within the small, firelit room, 6 pairs of eyes, none quite able to meet another's, sat with the growing, uncomfortable certainty that the storm outside had passed, but the danger within had not. Old wounds. The morning wore on, and with Mr. Dobbin's help, the body of Bertie Finch had been moved to the cold, unused scullery at the back of the house. The closest thing to a proper resting place the inn could offer until the roads cleared and word could finally reach the authorities. Mrs. Florence had insisted, gently but firmly, that nothing in the yard be disturbed further, and that scrap of torn paper she had spotted earlier remained exactly where the snow had half buried it, waiting for a quieter moment to retrieve. That moment came shortly after luncheon, a subdued affair of cold ham and little conversation, when the household scattered to their separate corners, each guest seeking whatever solitude the small inn could provide. Mrs. Florence took the opportunity to slip out to the yard alone, retrieved the scrap with careful fingers, and returned to the sitting room to examine it properly by the fire's light. It was a torn corner of what had once been a letter, the ink slightly smeared where the snow had touched it, but still legible enough. Cannot keep paying for your silence forever. If you say one word to Evelyn about what happened in... The rest was torn away, the name of the place lost with it, but the meaning was plain enough to send a small, cold thread of certainty through Mrs. Florence's mind. Blackmail, she thought. And Bertie Finch, our cheerful commercial traveller, with his too loud laugh and his too many brandies, was not quite so harmless as he wished us to believe. It was Mrs. Dobbin, bringing in fresh tea some while later, who, perhaps loosened by shock, or simply grateful for someone willing to listen, provided the next piece of the puzzle, entirely unprompted. I oughtn't gossip, not with a man lying dead in my own scullery, she said, setting down the tray with hands that still trembled faintly. But there's something been troubling me since this morning, Mrs. Ashworth, and I don't rightly know what to do with it." She glanced toward the door, lowering her voice. "Last night, before dinner, I went up to air the rooms, and I couldn't help but overhear, through the wall, Mr. Finch talking to someone, laughing, in that way of his. He said, 'I heard it plain as anything. A man in my position could make quite a comfortable living, keeping certain secrets to himself.' And then something about a colonel, though I didn't catch the whole of it." Mrs. Florence's needles, which had resumed their quiet work some minutes before, paused entirely. "Did you happen to hear who he was speaking with, Mrs. Dobbin?" "That I couldn't say. The wall's thick enough to muffle voices, if not stop them altogether. But it was a man's voice answering him back, angry, low. I didn't linger to hear more. Didn't seem my business." It was, Mrs. Florence thought, precisely her business now, though she thanked Mrs. Dobbin warmly and said nothing further, letting the woman retreat to her kitchen, with her conscience somewhat eased. A colonel, she thought, and a torn letter concerning silence and a young woman named Evelyn. The threads were beginning, ever so slowly, to draw together into something resembling a shape. She found Colonel Whitcomb alone in the small library off the sitting room some time later, ostensibly reading, though Mrs. Florence noted the book lay open to the same page it had been some 20 minutes before, when she had first glimpsed him through the door. "Colonel, might I trouble you for a few moments? I find myself rather in need of company, and everyone else seems to have scattered to their own thoughts." He set the book aside with visible reluctance. "Of course, Mrs. Ashworth. Though I confess I've little cheerful conversation to offer, under the circumstances. None of us do, I'm afraid." She settled into the chair opposite him, her manner mild, almost apologetic, the manner she had found over many years that persuaded people to say rather more than they intended. "I wonder, Colonel, whether you knew Mr. Finch before last night. There seemed, if you'll forgive my saying so, a certain tension between you at dinner that struck me as rather older than a single evening's acquaintance." The Colonel's composure did not crack, quite, but it strained visibly at the seams. "I'd never laid eyes on the man before yesterday. Curious," Mrs. Florence said gently. "Only Mrs. Dobbin happened to overhear a rather interesting conversation last evening. A man's voice, angry, speaking with Mr. Finch about matters that sounded a great deal like blackmail. And a torn letter I found in the snow this morning mentions a colonel and a young woman named Evelyn, and money paid, I think, to purchase someone's silence." She let the words settle, watching him with the patient, unhurried attention of a woman who had all the time in the world, and no particular urgency to fill the silence herself. For a long moment, Colonel Whitcomb said nothing at all. When he finally spoke, the military bearing had gone entirely out of him, leaving behind something older and considerably more tired. "It wasn't blackmail. Not exactly. Not the way you make it sound." He rubbed a hand across his face. "Evelyn's father, my brother, died badly in debt, some years back. Gambling, mostly, though there were other troubles besides. I've spent every year since trying to see her settled, provided for, without the truth of it ever touching her. Finch found out, somehow, some old connection of his, from his traveling business. I never learned quite how. He's been squeezing small sums from me for the better part of a year. Nothing enormous, just enough to remind me, every few months, that he could ask for more, whenever he chose. And last night, he raised the price." The Colonel's jaw tightened, old anger surfacing beneath the exhaustion. "Told me, quite cheerfully, that being snowbound together gave him rather a lot of time to think about what my silence was truly worth to me. I told him exactly what I thought of the suggestion. We argued. I'll not deny that." He looked up at her, and for the first time, something like genuine fear moved behind his eyes. "But I did not kill him, Mrs. Ashworth. Whatever else I am not a murderer." "Then you have nothing to fear from my questions, Colonel," Mrs. Florence said, with a gentleness that did not entirely soften the steel beneath it. "Only from your own silence should you continue to withhold what might otherwise clear your name." She left him there, staring into the unlit hearth, and made her way back toward the sitting room with a great deal more to consider than she had possessed an hour before. A blackmailer with a growing list of victims, a colonel with motive, means, and, crucially, no one at all to confirm his whereabouts through the small hours of the night beyond his niece's own hasty, too quick assurance. And yet, Mrs. Florence paused at the foot of the stairs, frowning slightly at a thought that had been nagging at the edge of her mind since that morning in the snow. The colonel was a proud man, and an angry one certainly, but the crime she had examined in the yard bore none of the marks of anger. No frenzy, no excess. It bore, instead, the cold, careful precision of someone who had planned each step with considerable patience. Blackmail gives a man motive enough to wish another dead, she thought, resuming her climb toward her room, where her knitting bag and a few quiet hours of undisturbed thought awaited her. But motive alone has never yet told me who held the knife. There is still a great deal more of this house's silence, I think, left to uncover. Behind her, somewhere in the depths of the inn, a floorboard creaked, soft, deliberate, and quickly still. The trap is set. By late afternoon, the light outside had begun its early winter fade, the sky pressing down grey and heavy over the unbroken snow, and Mrs. Florence had reached the particular stillness of mind that came, in her experience, just before the final pieces of a puzzle settled into their proper places. She sat alone in her small room, the grey woolen sock forgotten in her lap, turning over each fact she had gathered like stones in a riverbed, searching for the one that did not quite belong. A blackmailer, dead in the snow, with no footprints leading to or from his body. A colonel with motive enough, but whose fury, she was increasingly certain, did not match the cold precision of the crime. A niece whose hesitation over her own alibi had never quite left Mrs. Florence's thoughts. A briefcase, guarded like treasure, belonging to a man who grew sharp and defensive at the mildest question. And a broad-shouldered stranger who claimed to have walked miles through a blizzard on a broken-down car's account, and who moved through the house, she had noticed more than once, with the quiet, watchful confidence of a man who had done this sort of watching before. Means, any of them possessed. Opportunity, the storm gave to all equally, sealing us together with no possibility of outside interference. She set down her knitting entirely now, folding her hands atop it. It is motive, then, that must narrow the field. And motive, I think, is not so simple a thing as blackmail alone. There was one detail that had troubled her since the very first moment she'd knelt beside the body. A small, physical fact that she had turned over a dozen times since, without yet finding a place for it. Finch's expression, in death, had not held the blank surprise of a man attacked by someone he distrusted or feared. It had held something closer to recognition, the particular, almost relaxed recognition of a man who had expected to see a familiar, unthreatening face, right up until the very last moment when it proved otherwise. He was not afraid of whoever met him in that yard, she thought. Not until it was already too late to matter. Which meant, she reasoned, that whoever had lured Bertie Finch out into the freezing dark had done so with an invitation he had no reason to refuse. Not a threat, not a summons, but something that struck him instead as an opportunity. A blackmailer, offered the chance of easy money, might well walk trustingly toward his own end. It was this thought, turning over and over in her mind, that finally led Mrs. Florence downstairs that evening with a plan considerably more deliberate than her earlier, gentler inquiries. She found Mrs. Dobbin in the kitchen and spoke with her quietly for several minutes, the innkeeper's wife nodding along with growing understanding, before Mrs. Florence made her way to the sitting room, where the remaining guests had gathered once more before the fire, drawn together less by comfort now than by the simple, human unwillingness to be alone. "I wonder," Mrs. Florence said, settling into her usual chair with the mild, unhurried manner that had, by now, become entirely familiar to the room. whether I might share something I've been considering, since this has all been rather a great deal for one old woman to puzzle through alone. The room's attention gathered toward her, wary and watchful in equal measure. I believe, she continued, that Mr. Finch went out to that yard willingly last night, not lured by threat, nor forced by violence, but persuaded, by the promise, I think, of some transaction he expected to profit from. A man does not walk calmly to his death unless he believes, right up until the final moment, that he is walking towards something he wants. She let her gaze move slowly around the circle, which tells me that whoever met him there offered him something he found difficult to resist. Money, perhaps, or the settling, once and for all, of some arrangement between them. "You think one of us paid him off," Marsh said flatly, "and then killed him anyway, once the money changed hands." "I think it entirely possible," Mrs. Florence agreed, "which raises a rather interesting question. If money did change hands in that yard last night, it would not have vanished into the snow along with poor Mr. Finch. It would have gone somewhere, into a pocket, a room, a hiding place rather closer to home than the drift where his body was found." She paused, allowing the weight of the suggestion to settle fully before continuing. "I have asked Mrs. Dobbin to prepare a light supper for us all, within the hour. In the meantime, I wonder whether each of us might not consent, quite voluntarily of course, to a brief look through our own rooms and belongings. Nothing so dramatic as a search, merely a chance for each of us to demonstrate, to the satisfaction of the whole group, that we have nothing to hide in this matter." The suggestion landed with visibly different weight across the room. Colonel Whitcomb, having already confessed the whole of his own secret that afternoon, merely nodded, wearied but unsurprised. Evelyn Carr's face had gone rather pale, though she said nothing. Marsh shrugged with apparent indifference, and Aldous Price's hand moved, once again, to rest protectively atop his document case. "I don't see," Price said, his voice tight, "why my private business papers should be subject to public inspection over a matter that has nothing whatever to do with them." "No one need see the contents of your business, Mr. Price," Mrs. Florence said mildly. "I ask only that you demonstrate, as we all shall, that no sum of money changed hands in that yard last night, nor any object connected to Mr. Finch's death remains hidden among your things. A small thing, surely, for an innocent man to prove." Price said nothing further, but the tightness in his jaw told its own story. It was, Mrs. Florence reflected, as the group dispersed reluctantly toward their rooms under Mr. Dobbin's watchful escort, precisely the sort of pressure that so often revealed far more than any direct accusation ever could. Innocent people, asked to prove their innocence, generally did so with irritation perhaps, but without true fear. It was only the guilty who felt the walls of a trap closing, however gently, around them, and guilt, in Mrs. Florence's long experience, had a way of making itself known through the smallest, most involuntary of gestures, a hand that strayed too often to a particular pocket, a room entered with just a beat too much reluctance, an explanation offered before any question had been properly asked. She did not join the search herself. Instead, she remained in the sitting room, her knitting once more in her lap, and waited, for she had learned, over a great many years and a great many small village mysteries, that the last and most important part of any trap was simply the patience to let it close on its own. Somewhere above her, she heard a door open, and then, after a pause just slightly too long to be entirely innocent, close again. There, she thought, her needles clicking softly in the firelit quiet. "I rather think we are getting close now." Outside, the last grey light faded entirely from the sky, and the sleeping fox settled into its second night of secrets, though this time Mrs. Florence felt quite certain it would not keep them for very much longer. What the storm could not hide. Supper was a quiet, tense affair, eaten more from habit than appetite, and it was not until the plates had been cleared and the small group had gathered once more before the fire that Mrs. Florence rose from her chair, her knitting set aside at last, and addressed the room with the calm, unhurried authority of a woman who had, at long last, finished counting her stitches. "I believe," she said, "that I owe you all an explanation, and I believe, too, that it is time we brought this matter to its proper conclusion." The room stilled entirely. Even the fire seemed to hold its breath. "When I first knelt beside Mr. Finch yesterday morning," she began, "I was struck by something rather curious about his expression. Not the fear of a man who has been attacked by someone he distrusts, but the last, fading recognition of a man who believed, right up until the very end, that he was walking toward an opportunity, not a danger. Someone lured him into that yard with a promise he found impossible to refuse." "We searched everyone's rooms," Colonel Whitcomb said, a note of impatience creeping into his voice. "Nothing was found." "Nothing obvious, certainly," Mrs. Florence agreed, "which is precisely what troubled me. A man does not commit so careful a crime and then leave his proceeds lying carelessly upon a dressing table. He hides them somewhere rather less obvious." She turned, slowly, toward the window, where Marsh stood exactly as he had stood every evening since his arrival, arms crossed, face unreadable, watching the dark glass rather than the room behind him. "Which is why, Mr. Marsh, I asked Mrs. Dobbin this afternoon to take rather particular note of your coat hanging in the hall. A coat that seemed," she observed, "considerably heavier than a single day's travel could account for. Heavier, in fact, along the lining, in a manner that suggested something had been sewn quite carefully inside it." Marsh's expression did not change, but his stillness took on a different quality entirely. The stillness of a man calculating rather than simply waiting. "Mrs. Dobbin," Mrs. Florence said gently, "would you be so kind?" The innkeeper's wife stepped forward, her hands trembling slightly, and produced from beneath her apron the heavy travelling coat, along with a small bundle of banknotes she had carefully unstitched from its lining. A sum, Mrs. Florence noted, considerably larger than any commercial traveller's honest wages could easily explain. "That proves nothing," Marsh said, his voice flat, though something beneath the flatness had begun, at last, to crack. "A man's entitled to carry his savings however he pleases." "Perhaps," Mrs. Florence allowed, "except that among these notes, Mr. Dobbin discovered something rather more telling than money alone." She produced, from her own knitting bag, the torn scrap of paper she had retrieved from the snow the previous morning, and held it up for the room to see. This fragment mentions silence and payment and a colonel, precisely the arrangement Colonel Whitcomb has already, quite bravely, confessed to us this afternoon. "I believed, at first, that this letter had been written to the colonel by Mr. Finch, demanding payment, but the handwriting, I think, does not match the colonel's own, nor, indeed, Mr. Finch's, which I had occasion to see on his hotel registration ledger downstairs." She looked, at last, directly at Marsh. "It matches, rather more closely, a note I found folded inside your coat pocket this evening, Mr. Marsh, arranging tonight's meeting in the yard." The silence that followed was absolute. "You knew Mr. Finch before this storm ever brought you together, didn't you?" Mrs. Florence continued, her voice gentle but unrelenting, the voice of a woman laying down each card with quiet, patient certainty. "Not as strangers thrown together by chance, but as partners of a rather longer standing. He was the charming one, I think, the one who gathered the secrets, who made the small inquiries, who collected the money with that cheerful laugh of his that made people forget to be suspicious. And you were the one who did the quieter work behind him, the following, the watching, the occasional, necessary persuasion when a victim proved reluctant to pay." Marsh said nothing, but his jaw had tightened, and his eyes, for the first time since Mrs. Florence had met him, betrayed something close to fear. "But partnerships, like storms, do not always hold," she went on. "I believe Mr. Finch decided, at some point in recent months, that he no longer wished to share his profits. Perhaps he grew greedy. Perhaps he simply grew tired of splitting what he considered his own cleverness. Either way, he began keeping the proceeds for himself, the Colonel's payments among them. And you, Mr. Marsh, discovered the deception. You did not arrive at this inn by the misfortune of a broken-down car, I think. You followed him, trailed his own vehicle through the early hours of that storm, on foot when the roads grew too treacherous even for driving, determined to confront him wherever he finally stopped. You can't prove any of this, Marsh said, though the words carried none of their earlier conviction. I can prove, Mrs. Florence said calmly, that you arranged to meet him last night with the promise of settling accounts peacefully, a promise he believed, since a man walking toward violence rarely walks so calmly to his own end. I can prove that money changed hands in that yard, money which somehow found its way, by morning, sewn into the lining of your coat rather than his. And I can prove, now, that the note arranging that meeting was written in your own hand, found among your own belongings. She folded the torn scrap and set it gently upon the table before her. The rest, Mr. Marsh, I rather suspect you will find easier to confess than to continue denying. For a long moment, Marsh said nothing at all, his broad shoulders rigid, his eyes moving once around the small circle of faces watching him. Colonel Whitcomb's cold fury, Evelyn's wide-eyed horror, Price's stunned relief at his own sudden irrelevance to the matter, before something in him seemed, at last, to give way entirely. He was going to leave me with nothing, Marsh said, his voice low and bitter now, stripped of all its earlier flatness. 5 years we'd worked together, 5 years of my planning, my patience, while he swanned about with his charm and his brandy, taking all the credit and half again the money that was rightfully mine. He told me, that night in the yard, that our arrangement was finished, that he'd found richer pickings on his own, and I could take what he offered or take nothing at all. His hands curled into fists at his sides. I offered him one last chance to see reason. He laughed at me, so I took back what was mine. And believed, Mrs. Florence said quietly, that the storm would take the rest of the truth along with it. Marsh said nothing further. There was, in the end, nothing further to say. It was Mr. Dobbin who moved first, taking up a length of rope from the kitchen with grim, practical efficiency, while Colonel Whitcomb assisted in seeing Marsh secured to a chair in the small back room until such time as the roads cleared and proper authorities could be summoned. The confession itself, given so plainly and so completely, would need no further coaxing. By the time Mrs. Florence made her way back to the sitting room, the fire had burned low, and outside, for the first time in 2 days, a thin band of pale morning light had begun to break through the retreating clouds, catching the endless white fields in a soft, forgiving gold. Evelyn Carr found her there a little while later, settling into the chair opposite, with something like genuine warmth in her expression, for the first time since the storm had trapped them all together. "How did you know, Mrs. Ashworth? Truly, it seemed almost like magic, the way you laid it all out." "Not magic, my dear, only patience, and a great deal of watching." Mrs. Florence took up her knitting once more, her needles resuming their familiar, comforting rhythm. People believe, so very often, that a storm like this one offers a kind of cover, that chaos and confusion will hide whatever they've done, simply because no one can see clearly through the snow. But storms pass, in the end, and what's left behind, once the snow settles, is always rather easier to see than anyone standing in the middle of it ever expects. She smiled, small and knowing, and glanced toward the window, where the last of the clouds were finally breaking apart to reveal a clear, cold winter sky. The wildest storm, Miss Carr, has never yet managed to hide a cold enough heart. It only ever delays the moment someone troubles themselves to look. Outside, the wind had gone entirely still, and across the vast, silent white of the moor, the first true light of morning spread slowly, steadily, over everything the blizzard had tried, and failed, to conceal.